Chapter 15. I'm not even safe in a graveyard. When I woke up the next afternoon, the lower back problem was back, but compared to what had happened to Shadow, it was nothing. Hide it as he might, he still looked as if he was in a bit of discomfort, and I took a moment to wonder how I might feel had some bastard ripped my leg open with a pan-galactic laser gun. I'm sure I'd still be complaining. I was being ignored again. My back was not the worst thing about the day. I knew it could only mean trouble for everyone if the evil twins were back. But were they the evil twins? It's not that Shadow was heavy, certainly not then, but he appeared to be larger in comparison. The twins still bore an uncanny resemblance to him. Shadow at an earlier stage in his timeline? He noticed my gaze, and I pointed at the other two, and offered an intrigued inquiry with my eyes. He looked at them both, then back to me. He said nothing. Okay, I said quietly. The twins noticed and in turn looked at me, but clearly didn't want to hold me in their attention any longer than they had to. Not that they ignored me. It felt more like I'd been returned to the status of insignificant once again. But, as Jenny once told me, there is joy and tranquility to be found in being invisible, especially while all others aspire for significance. I read somewhere that ambition and ignorance are the required skill sets for that. Yet, when I looked at the cats, engineers or whatever they were, ignoring me and chatting silently on the sofa, I knew neither cared a hoot about being important. I now understood that the end was far more critical than any medals for the cats and the warriors. After seeing the warriors in action, that term was more appropriate than cows or bulls. Humans were little more than a minor sideshow in the Old One and his colleagues' battle against an enemy yet to be formally identified to me. Everything strange I'd been party to over the past few months was clearly beyond human understanding. Something being played out invisibly in plain sight had brought all these bad-tempered heroes and heroines to our little planet. Even years after leaving my last job, I still suffered from PTSD, and occasionally flashbacks jumped up and down inside my head. Curiously, many of the flashbacks were related to events other than those that caused the PTSD. Nevertheless, it felt like it had brought me to a critical mass of experiences. And when hell was overfull of unnecessary rubbish, it felt free to launch itself at me with any terrible memory to hand. I mention that as a context for my involuntary flinch and groan as Evil Reg's head exploded in front of me once again. I turned to Shadow and his colleagues on the sofa and found them staring back at me, seemingly surprised by my outburst. I held up my hand in apology. The evil twins looked to Shadow for some guidance, and he must have answered their inquiry because I sensed a shrug coming from their direction. And whatever their topic was, they returned to it as I rotated my poor back and staggered toward my next savior, the kettle. All the while, I could still feel Shadow's eyes on me. That heavy photons thing. I leaned heavily on the thick edge of the sink, glad there was already water in the kettle, sparing me even that minor task. I felt I'd already done too much for the day, in the few minutes I'd been up. I pressed down the kettle switch and returned my survival grasp to the sink. I only hoped I wouldn't be tarnishing its shiny whiteness with the products of a multicolored yawn. For some reason, a pretty ironic one considering, I looked at the sink and thought of Irene, who reminded me of Reg, which reminded me of his brains and I sliding down the mirror staring into oblivion. Then my legs chose to abandon their primary purpose, and in a second-hand fashion, I vaguely felt my right temple bang heavily on the edge of the sink. My head flicked back and I was the gladdest person in the world as I willingly reached out to embrace a pleasant nothingness. It was a form of reassuring practice as far as I was concerned. I was disappointed to wake up from that sensory-free non-conscious nothingness to a stinking headache a few hours later, which could easily have been down to the bottle of wine I'd drunk. It might also have been down to the Belfast sink hurling itself at me. I had no idea how I got into bed, but that's where I was, fully clothed and my head banging. The near-obsolete mirror on my wardrobe revealed a big black bruise on my left temple. I'd survive. After all, worse things happen at sea. I made a seriously strong cup of coffee and stood near the sink, looking down at Shadow, who was now alone and asleep. His amigos had undoubtedly popped off somewhere to cause or practice all manner of havoc, and I wondered what they'd been discussing. Like most things in my current life, it was probably above my pay grade, but still involved me somehow. I hadn't been to the cemetery for a while and was overdue for a visit to make sure all was fine. Quite early on, I'd learned that you should never look back at a family gravestone when you leave the cemetery. Mum had chosen a beautiful black stone for Dad. The problem with shiny black stones is that you can never leave them perfectly clean. I used to turn and check before leaving and always spotted something I'd missed that needed brushing off. In the early days, I'd go back again and again after spotting speck after speck after speck. In the end, I stopped doing that, deciding that they'd accept that I was doing my best to do my best. And after all, That's as good as most of us ever get, which I reckon it's more than good enough. My father was a gentle, sentimental man and only occasionally given to a flash of anger that disappeared as soon as it turned up. Both my parents were well liked and highly respected, and I found that with the few left of their generation, I had no identity other than Will's son or Maya's son. I was very happy with that. And I sometimes felt I was disappearing as each of their friends followed them. That reassuring association would soon be gone, and then I'd become truly invisible. All that was best had gone, and I really longed to be with them again. Unlike my kind and gentle parents, I'd learned to become cold and silent when challenging situations arose. And they were probably evil Reg's last thoughts about me before he exploded. But it was much simpler than that. I'd found that silence could be more intimidating and more manageable. It had less immediate physical implications than smacking someone in the face. Before I parted for the cemetery, the amigos had returned, and so I left all three cats together on the sofa. One minute they weren't there, the next, I was again a figure of contempt. It was a cute greeting card scene if you put aside the simple truth that these three were possibly the most dangerous lifeforms currently on the planet. Probably the most dangerous in this part of space or universe at that time. A general and 2 engineers. I reckoned that I must still have been over the drink drive limit heading into town, and I felt guilty. Nonetheless, I had to talk to someone. Jenny was out of the question because she'd think I'd lost my marbles. Still, Crazy Leaf had just made an appearance, and I was glad that his spirit persisted despite the woodland being destroyed. I could see him dancing in the clear evening air in the trees at the bottom of the cemetery. My guardian angel was about and keeping an eye on me, which was reassuring. The world had suddenly become a very precarious place, and I was one of the only persons on the planet who knew something very bad was happening. A cemetery is definitely a place for the living, because the dead have moved on if they were lucky, which is my hope for them anyway. And you would never see Satan in a beautiful cemetery unless he was there to bemoan the souls forever beyond his reach. Either it was that, or he had another agenda. I was down at the bottom near the trees, applying a damp cloth to the stone and telling my parents about my recent adventures. "You're a bit late for anyone here," I said. I didn't even bother turning to look at him because I'd smelled his unique fragrance long before I saw him. Not everyone. The witty, urbane, wine-loving Johnny Depp type of character was gone. This voice was callous and ugly, and I bet myself that I had a fight on my hands. But on the positive side, I was still suffering a horrible hangover and I was in a very bad mood and happy to thump him if he tried anything. This bastard deserved a darned good kicking for what he'd done in Carmel. I let out a long and tired sigh before turning around. Alleged Satan was below me, leaning against the raised wall that kept graves and bones from tumbling onto the footpath. His back was turned, and I could only see his face in part profile. This version was of an appallingly, unrepentantly immoral, decadent, ugly bastard. And that summed him up quite well. I looked at where he was leaning, and knew from experience there was a giant ant's nest right by him. I'd sat on the very spot last month. "That looks painful," he said after turning and noticing the dark bruise on my temple. "When did that happen?" "That sort of bruise never looks good in social gatherings, you know. People might think you've been drinking too much or something like that. Humans can be so judgmental. Don't you find?" The bastard sniggered. I mean, what else was the bastard going to do? I considered something ironic from one of John Betjeman's poems as a response, but settled for a piss-off. I'm sure Sir John would have forgiven the foul language. I'll bet he was all for the appropriate bon mot. Satan, alleged Satan anyway, said, "He can't always protect you, you know." Why do I need to be protected? I'm no one, and I like being no one. The world needs more no ones. There aren't enough of us here, I'd say. Myself, I blame social media. Evil incarnate twisted his upper half and offered me a disingenuous smile. Why that particular expression from his bag of tricks I don't know. Alleged Satan inclined his head in acknowledgement and brought those all-black eyes to bear on me again. Those eyes had rattled me in my own house, but in the cemetery in the late afternoon light, they were odd rather than frightening. In anyone's books it was still a cheap trick. He needed to come up with something else soon because even the most appalling threats lose their impact eventually. And I could always punch him first. "It doesn't have to be like this," he said. So much for his claim to be able to read minds. Really? I was bored and appalled by this bastard and couldn't help showing it, and I don't think he cared very much for my flippant demeanor. By a human of all creatures? Not at all the correct order of things. I hadn't become more courageous or foolish in recent times. I think I was more aware of games, and consequently more prone to push back. I didn't care. Either that, or deep down somewhere I knew something. I was disappointing myself again because Reg's head had just exploded and was doing a further lap of honor, this time in deathly slow motion. And I must have flinched or something because he seemed pleased by that. All this made me feel like smashing his face into the concrete and leaving him there for the ants to finish the job. It's a fact that I usually go cold and silent when I'm angry, but there have been odd occasions when I've actually gone apeshit. And this could be another one of those strange moments in life. There again, I might be picking a fight with the wrong person. But like I said, I was bloody angry at this smarmy bastard who seemed to feel it was fine and dandy to manipulate and undermine. It would be interesting to see what happened here if I went into rage and fury mode. Instead, I smiled a tired smile and took a moment to place a hand on my parents' gravestone to reach for the support of their decency and strength. Just for a moment I wondered if the cats were around somewhere. I knew Crazy Leaf was here, and I knew that he'd be watching closely. But unfortunately I couldn't see him. Great. And no cats in sight either. I was alone with this bastard yet again. That was so dominant of you, wasn't it? Makes you feel clever and dominant, does it? That's the joy of being evil, is it? Alleged Satan frowned darkly at my attitude and waved a hand dismissively. That was nothing. Nothing. Forgetting my lower back pain of the morning, I hopped on off the retaining wall onto the path and took a few steps toward him, still keeping a safe distance from the alleged Lord of Darkness. My back was surprisingly better. Maybe the cat was helping again? I already suspected that he'd had the car fixed for me. As it was, I was beginning to question everything unexpected those days. Alleged Satan's fragrance was just as bad out here in the fresh air as it had been during our last encounter in my now fumigated little cottage. So what was it with this guy? Was his entire existence about being offensive? That was so brave of you to blow apart a frail, frightened old man like that, I said. What was it supposed to achieve other than me finding out there are beings out there after you and your sort? My sort? He leaned his feral head forward angrily. You think there are others like me? We were almost spitting in each other's faces. There's always someone bigger, faster and meaner, I said. So I'm wondering where you actually stand in any food chain. And while you don't think much of us humans, I assure you somebody does. At this point, I realized that I'd finally lost my temper completely, and probably stepped over some sort of line, and it wasn't unreasonable to expect to be snuffed out any moment. And all the while, steam must have been rising off him because I could sense the loathing and anger growing inside him. Both of us had definitely gone off the deep end this time. Bugger it, you bastard. I got right in his face again, enduring his fragrance and ugliness. Even in my wild anger I guess this had to be a strength coming through from elsewhere, because I knew that even in my worst raging fury I would never have dared do this. Our noses were almost touching as we continued to hurl venomous epithets at each other, but the smell was becoming unbearable and I had to draw back. Then I saw it for the first time. I could have sworn I saw uncertainty there. Then just for the briefest of moments, those black eyes flickered sideways away from me. Which is when he moved to phase 2 in his attempt to terrorize this useless human. The wind rose suddenly around us, buffeting me, and I struggled to stay on my feet. I should kill you this very moment, he spat. And I could see he was sorely tempted. Instead, he grabbed my shirt and pushed me to arm's length. Look about you, and realize that you are no longer home. No one will ever come and rescue you here. Abruptly, what had been a pretty dull day colored by my hangover became colder and darker. And I was no longer in the cemetery. Instead, I was in a dark land of violent lightning and swirling mists, a gale thrusting at me from all directions. I was uncertain whether it was the two of us revolving in the mist, clouds, or the other way round. But again, the clouds were that familiar nauseating mustard color. I knew I was no longer in Kansas and it was yet another test of who I actually was. I felt it was a time to be ridiculously, pointlessly brave. And there was no audience to cheer me on. It all came down to me and no one else. I shouted at him. 2 things you should know about me. On the first, you're probably correct in your assumption, but on the second, who knows? 1, I can't fight. I've never been able to fight. Second, and this has always been a curse on me, I never back down. But, he snarled at me, but what? I think I'm about to make an exception to assumption 1 in your case. He dismissed the very notion and pulled me tight into him. I thrust my hands against his chest and was disturbed by the harshness of that bony structure beneath those clothes. Look around you properly. What if I just leave you here alone? He waved his bony spare hand, and the clouds below us disappeared. I thought quite simply because I hadn't followed it through, that we were still both standing in the cemetery, and this was all part of a hallucination he was forcing on me. But the view down below my feet disabused me of that silly notion. I saw that what we were both standing on was absolutely nothing. Yet I could still feel a hard surface beneath my shoes. But it couldn't be so because I stood there high up in midair, held by this monster, and the land was miles below us. Occasionally, Breaks in the tumbling yellow clouds revealed the darkest purple and sharp mountains below us. They cast their harsh shadows across an endless barren plain. And there was a darker massive shadow, endlessly pulsing forward and backwards. This is Shadow's nightmare, I realized with shock. It hadn't been a dream after all, it was a nightmare in stark reality. What the hell was I doing here? I stayed still and moved my head from side to side, seeing hideous land coming into view through holes in the clouds so far below me. I closed my eyes and told myself, we're still in the cemetery. We're still in the cemetery. We're still in the cemetery. This is only an illusion. This is only an illusion. I opened my eyes again and looked down to see my feet still resting on nothing. We were both suspended in midair above the hideous landscape far, far below. The good news is that the fall will not kill you because you'll be consumed long before that. The gaps closed up again, and the clouds rose to meet us. There. I could see them. Familiar shadows swimming over each other in the clouds and snapping like sharks. They were there. The voracious chicken-turkey monsters all eager to have another go at me. Why not bring the team together again like in a Hollywood musical? Was there anything else he could bring in to scare me? I needed something sharp, so I could bring the fight to them and die in a manner and time of my choosing by hitting the ground. He shook me roughly. I let you go, and you are gone forever. He played with me by loosening his grip. It had to be an illusion, I told myself. It couldn't be real. Surely. It was an illusion being created by this evil, ugly, angular creature who was weaving the imagery and seeking to break into my mind. But I wasn't broken. He was only skirting the periphery of my mind, where the familiar human fears always waited to be corrupted and turned against us. I knew he couldn't break in further than that because Shadow had already been there. It had to be that, otherwise how could I accept all these awful things that had been happening to me and had me moving undisturbed from one appalling event to the next? Maybe he was there right now. Alleged Satan must have noticed the change in me. You realize you're alone, he rasped as he leaned in. The heat of his appalling sulphurous cadaverous breath on my face forced me to twist my head away. Your little friend is obviously damaged beyond being able to assist you this time. Hell, I said. Can't you do something about your breath? Tell you what, just drop me. Rather than drop me, all he did was incline his head in confusion. I was still standing there sort of, threatened with appalling death. Yet to him I must have seemed untroubled and unafraid. Here, I said, grabbed his bony hand, and tore at it with all my strength. At the same time I took an impossible step back in midair and kicked him hard in what must have passed for a knee. He groaned and let me go. I didn't fall. Anything but. Because my surmise had been correct. Sometimes the bleed-in obvious is the bleed-in obvious. He really should learn to be more sneaky. My knees may have given a bit, but I quickly recovered and was reminded I had a lower back problem. Behind the bastard there weren't any monsters in attendance. Instead, I saw the back of my parents' grave, and so I laughed and took a quick step back as he reached for me again. Well, wasn't that interesting, I said. More wibbly-wobbly shit. I rearranged my shirt and shook my head appreciatively. Not bad that. That was a strange one on the whole. But it was all in here. I tapped my temple before pushing him away. It felt dangerous and curious watching alleged Satan stand before me, just off a full boil. I'll make you suffer, he raged. You had your chance, and yet you didn't, I shouted at him. Again, I was beginning to lose interest. I really must stop doing that in case he thinks I'm trying to be rude. His hand flew at my throat again, his face transforming into that cold feral beast who'd revealed himself on my sofa and threatened me. I gently placed my hands around his and squeezed those long cold fingers. I took another step back and carried on squeezing and staring at him. Even though I could feel enormous strength, I was far too intrigued by his inability to kill me to be afraid. Finally, he pulled his hands away with a suddenness that almost made me lose my balance. I glanced at where the ants had been earlier, passing on to them my irritation and hatred for this smug and malevolent entity. The illusion hadn't fooled them because they were still teeming over the concrete from their nearby nest in the soil. I knew there was no intelligence behind their action, only a defense contingency. However, as I already knew about myself, sometimes you just have to depend on your unconscious to deal with existential threats. And the ants definitely recognized this person or thing as a threat. I turned away, because this bastard looked like he was about to begin pontificating or some new crap. Maybe he was going to say something unexpectedly reasonable like, why can't we all just get along or something? I needed to figure out how to play it from here. Running would have been a good idea, but with the state of my back I wouldn't get very far. All I wanted was to be at home, leaning against my door with a mug of coffee in my hand and praying no one else wanted to destroy what little was left in my life. Submissiveness had long left the building. And to be honest, we'd both been pretty rude to each other, probably far too harsh for an apology to sound genuine. But for all I knew, I had a role to play in their games, and this entity was trying something. But what? He must have known that Shadow would dump me the moment I became a liability. Whatever this one's game was, I really didn't have a clue. There was no reason I could think of why he should be attending to me, playing his frightening mind games, because we'd already established Shadow was in charge. Maybe he was trying to get into my head or something, but I'm sure he'd just realized there was probably nothing helpful in there for him other than Shadow's contemptuous smile. I'd run out of obvious things to say. The warriors had demonstrated that having Shadow's countenance meant something, and maybe it meant something with this thing before me. He was also thinking deeply and placed his left hand on the wall. I sensed rather than saw the movement and moved a few feet down the path, keeping all of his focus on me. "Let's think right back, shall we?" I said. "I'd say that in a short period of time, you've had your ass handed to you 3 times. Maybe even more. Of course, you could just say you weren't even trying, that it was a ruse to see just how strong and determined the enemy was. Ass in a sling, mate. If I'm the only vulnerability you've come across, then you're obviously wasting your time." "I've found plenty of weaknesses," he said, and added a full smile, which made me doubt his words. "Bollocks you have." I lowered my voice. After all, I was in a cemetery and I guessed the last thing the dead wanted was to be disturbed. I can honestly tell you that at that particular moment my doubtful soul shivered as I felt suddenly drenched by a shower of seething cold. And yet somehow, I was still managing to sweat under my arms. Is that biological irony? I tried to remain challenging though not dismissive. I'd probably even made a balls of that. "Just tell me. Why the hell are you wasting your time with me? I'm just a pathetic human who's not even the best example of his species." I looked away, knowing that he was continuing to eye me carefully. Maybe he was intrigued by the anger and disregard I had toward myself. However, perhaps, just perhaps, despite all my assertions and efforts, I was an average example of my species. Although that species wasn't all that good on a universal level. Alleged Satan clearly thought I was a weak link in what was going on, and he must have thought I had a significant role to play. But I just couldn't get past why he was standing here in the middle of a human cemetery talking to the village idiot. He already knew Shadow. And he now knew about Arthur and his warriors. It wasn't me he should be worried about. They were the players that should have concerned him. Was I a wildcard or something? I must have been the weirdest lifeform he'd ever come across. I didn't seem to care, which was worse than being fearless. That's it. Be wary of fighters who don't care how much you hit them. I smiled. He had to be so uncertain about me that he was confusing my ignorance for intelligence. More importantly, he was still oblivious to thousands of ants waving their antennae angrily and bringing all that formic acid to bear on his self-righteous evil ass. I didn't know what the battle was about other than there was probably an existential threat to the world. But we need those now and then to create what passes for solidarity, albeit always temporarily. He had to have realized that I was only a poor damaged sap who kept falling from one bit of universally contrived injury to the next. I was the struggling ex-drunk, the too soft incompetent creature who surfed indifferently around the periphery of anything important. The hangover was back front and center. My eyes, head and tummy were all competing for attention. I was irritated and I was fed up with being fed up. And I was sick and tired of feeling sick and tired. Sod it. I'd say that I was closer to being conflagrated than at any other time during our brief acquaintance. I was also closer to thumping him on the nose. Galactic battles surely couldn't be this pathetic, could they? He held out his hand. And I was pleased to see hundreds of ants crawling all over it. "Very funny," he said. "Very clever." The ants burned and hissed and fell off in their hundreds. I was proud of them all. They died bravely defending their home and queen. "I'm more than merely another lifeform," he said. "You have absolutely no idea of what I can do." "Don't tell me. You're a destroyer of worlds," I snapped back sarcastically. He cocked his head and seemed to engage in a serious bit of reflection on what I'd just said. He stared at me for a few moments, narrowed his eyes and then shook his head. Despite it being a dangerous thing to do, I was finding it difficult to keep my temper and my sarcasm in check. "Just one last thing," I said. Alleged Satan, who sought to persuade me that he knew everything, looked further intrigued, tilted his head and took a half step toward me. I didn't know whether it showed uncertainty or not, but I found it quite revealing nonetheless. "And what's that?" I pursed my dry lips and said, "I think it's obvious by now that I'm not scared of you." He snapped his head back and burst out laughing with that odd tinge of madness inserted for good measure. His stinking carcass and my horrible hangover meant I was on the verge of throwing up on his fine shoes. I regathered myself by staring at those shiny leather shoes. Credit to him, the bastard might stink but he had decent taste in shoes, although I wasn't going to compliment him on it. "Do you know? I began to say something and then realized I was being drawn in slowly. I turned away and started walking back up the path expecting an explosion of abuse and satanic stuff. The bastard's narcissism couldn't tolerate being dismissed like that. Whatever his issue, it was with Shadow and had nothing to do with me. I aspired to nothing. I aspired to avoiding responsibility for anything and anyone anymore. Instead of fire and brimstone and my putative soul being torn savagely from my earthly being, he just called after me. There has to be something you care about? I was a few paces past him and decided to turn around. Why does it matter to you? I get it that you don't want to be anyone of significance, he said, which is confusing considering you're a human. He gave a wry chuckle. But what if someone's made you a someone, and used you without your knowledge? Controlling your mind and actions. I felt like going back and kicking him in what might pass for nuts among the satanic. However, he had me there. Fair point, I conceded, much to his obvious disappointment. I pointed at alleged Satan and advised him never to be around Shadow if there were any more bananas in the fruit bowl. Have you no self-respect? He seemed genuinely surprised, disappointed even. I gave up that crap years ago when I saw I was no good at it. So I leave that shit to you and your ilk. I turned to leave once more when the bastard took 3 long steps toward me in his patent leather shiny black shoes. So it appears we've been wrong about you, he said. And you're not what we thought you were. Only true warriors care if they live or die. But you're pathetic. You've wasted my time, he sneered with distaste. I wasn't sure whether that was a positive thing coming from him. At least he didn't spit. Then, bold as you like, the bastard walked right through me. The most appropriate thing to have done right then would have been to pass out. Instead, having fallen through the stupid tree a few times and being viscerally intolerant of rotten bastards, I held on and merely staggered. Thankfully, my hand fell on top of the low retaining wall and I managed to steady myself. My vision was like the frozen interior of my childhood bedroom window. I didn't know whether I could survive that appalling sensation if he were to do it again. It felt like he'd brushed past my putative soul. My insides felt frozen solid and my knees nearly gave way. Breathing deeply made the internal refrigeration even worse. I could hear the evil bastard behind me cackling. His cackling stopped when I placed my other hand on the wall and shuffled around to face him. He seemed genuinely shocked. As if something completely unexpected had just happened. I felt so cold and damaged that standing still was about all I could do. My eyes cleared, and I stared at him with all the hatred and contempt I could muster. Alleged Satan brought up his hand gently and covered his mouth, looking utterly perplexed. What he was thinking I don't know, however, it was clear that I'd just done something out of the ordinary. Maybe I was supposed to die. I don't know. Right then I couldn't give a damn. I only wanted out of there. You still here, I managed to say. Isn't it time you went back to that shithole of yours, wherever that might be? He remained silent and seemed unable to hide his confusion. Who'd have thought that a feek and weeble human could wrongside alleged Satan? Nonetheless, there we were. An appalling arrogance challenged by a human standing steady on his 2 feet. Then his face narrowed and darkened into emaciated vertical lines. I didn't particularly appreciate how he looked at me. I take it that no one was supposed to withstand his evil. Such vanity. In less than diplomatic terms, I think I told you to piss off, didn't I? He was even more surprised that I managed to lift my feet and take a few threatening steps toward him. So surprised that he took a step back. I don't imagine such a thing had happened to him in the last few millennia. My intention must have been clear to him. And violent. He held up his palms in a gesture of mock surrender to stay me. His smile didn't touch those black eyes. Yet he continued to shake his head in disbelief. I heard him utter and repeat the same word over and over again slowly. Remarkable. I pointed at him as I spat out my words. If you ever come near me or my home or friends again, then I will find a way to destroy you. Is that clear? Abundantly, he replied while regaining his composure. I could see that I'd somehow rattled him. He disappeared with a small pop and left behind his stench and the residue of his confusion. And take your bloody stink with you, I shouted. Although there was only me and the offended dead left in attendance. The anger faded quickly because I couldn't afford it, and I nearly passed out for the second time in 12 hours. As dignified as I could manage, I shuffled around and sat heavily on the wall. I was aware that the ants were still on full alert and thankfully farther down the wall from me. At least I was no threat to them. I now had it on good authority that I was no threat to anyone. I sat there for a good 10 minutes, hoping my heart rate would slow down to a middling gallop, and I kept my hand over my mouth to warm up my inward breathing. I said goodbye to my parents and thanked them for my courage before gently making my way up toward my car by the cemetery entrance. I reached the car with only 5 stops along the way. That was less than I managed on the 3.5-mile journey back home. The dizziness ebbed and flowed abruptly, and I must have stopped 10 times, vomiting twice. The last stage, which seemed an impossible challenge, was the walk down the track to my bed. I felt as if I was suffering the mother of all hangovers. I had to stay in the car for more than an hour to gather the strength to get out. I'd upheld the values my parents had shown me by their example, but had paid a horrible price for it. I hope they were proud.